Hi and welcome, my dear friends of the underwater world, and today to a new tutorial that I've been wanting to do for a while and have now finally been able to realize. I hope you will enjoy it, and as always I look forward to receiving likes, comments, messages and subscription on all channels. Today I would like to explain to you what we are talking about when we talk about buoyancy when diving and why our BCD works at all. This time the underwater video footage was shot at the Monte Mare in Rheinbach, so I would like to take this opportunity to say a big thank you, because without this footage the entire tutorial would not have been so illustrative. We start with two hints. There are two experiments in the video, especially for the second one. I ask you to observe the following rules if you want to try it out yourself. Heavy objects should never be balanced with your wing, jacket or dry suit. If you drop the object, you will have too much buoyancy, and this can quickly lead to injuries or accidents when diving. When moving objects with lifting back, they should be moved as close to the bottom as possible and only brought to the surface directly at the entry or exit point. And finally, a tip that is also familiar from out of the water: never hold up under heavy objects. The second note refers to the information contained in the video. This is general basic physical knowledge and can be found in the relevant literature. And now, stay tuned. It will be worth it. Let's start with a little child's play to illustrate the topic of buoyancy. We take a simple balloon filled with air and, as you can see, it remains on the ground. But if I now put it in a bucket filled with water, it suddenly rises to the surface. That would be a figurative representation of buoyancy. But let's take a closer look at it. When we talk about buoyancy, we also mean the so-called buoyant force. As a formula, this is represented by the expression ρ times V times G. Rho is the density of the medium we are in. For example, how much a cubic meter of this substance weighs. In the example of the balloon, this would be water. V is the volume of the body of which we are considering the buoyancy. For example, the space occupied by the balloon. And G describes the gravitational constant or gravitational acceleration, a value that represents the gravitational pull of our planet. We'll look at everything in detail in a moment. Let's start by noting that buoyancy is a force that always counteracts the Earth's gravitational pull. If we look at the formula, we have several parameters that we can be used to change the buoyancy. Firstly, there is the density of the medium in which we find ourselves. We can influence this to a certain extent, namely by choosing our dive site. As salt is dissolved in the sea and salt water is heavier than fresh water, we have more buoyancy here, according to our formula. Anyone who has ever dived with the same equipment in both a lake and the sea should have noticed this. In the latter, you need more lead. The second way to influence buoyancy is the volume of the body. A larger volume also means a greater buoyant force. And finally, we have the gravitational constant. Even if it fluctuates slightly in different places on Earth, it can be assumed to be approximately constant. But keep it in mind if you ever want to dive on the Moon or Mars. We have now completed the theoretical part. And the next step, we will look at the forces acting on a body. The method presented here is called free cutting and is often used in engineering to analyze or calculate acting forces. The procedure is very simple. We draw all forces as an arrow with the tip pointing in the direction in which the force is acting. We have already mentioned the buoyant force, and the Earth's gravity also exerts a force on us or the body which we consider. This is also known as the force of weight. And finally, we have the force exerted on us by the water. In other words, the weight of the water above our body. Here you will also find a video on this channel that deals with the topic of pressure in more detail, and which I will link to in the description. The arrows drawn here show the direction in which the force is acting. In practice, of course, even more forces are conceivable, especially on steep walls. Upward or downward currents can pull you in one direction, but that would be too much at this point. With this knowledge, we can now distinguish between three cases. In the first case, the buoyant force is greater than the force due to the water pressure and the weight of the object. In this case, a positive buoyant force acts and the body rises in the direction of the water surface. We have already observed this with the balloon. Secondly, the opposite case is also conceivable, namely when the buoyant force is less than the weight force and the pressure from the water. The body would sink, and anyone who has ever lost lead while diving will know this situation very well. In this case, we speak of down force or negative buoyancy. This does not mean that there is no buoyancy. The buoyant force is just smaller than the other forces that cause the body to sink. Thirdly, and finally, there is the possibility that the upward buoyant force is exactly equal to the sum of the downward forces. As a well-balanced diver, this is exactly what we want to achieve and, if possible, maintain during the dive. Now we are ready to look at the experiment. I have taken my weight belt, packed 10 kg of lead into it, and am now asking myself how many liters of air I need to fill into my lifting bag to lift this belt. I'll show you the key data here. The belt with the lead in it weighs 10.6 kg and the volume is 2.65 liters, the equivalent of 0.00265 cubic meters. To simplify the whole thing, we will neglect the water pressure on the weight belt and the lifting bag as well as its own weight. However, you are welcome to guess or estimate how many liters of air we have to fill into the lifting bag to lift the belt. Feel free to post this in the comments. And now we are here in the Monte Mare in Rheinbach at a depth of around about 4 to 5 meters. As you can see, both the lifting bag and the weight belt have negative buoyancy. We now fill the lifting bag with air using the alternative second stage. First, the lifting bag rises and then the weight belt is also lifted. At this point, I strongly recommend that you do not hang on one of these or a similar construction. As the air expands, remember, greater volume results in greater buoyant force. The buoyant force increases as you ascend. There is already a video about this which you can find in my highlights on Instagram and will also be uploaded again here in the future. But let's get back to this topic and my question. How much air do you think was in the lifting bag to lift the weight belt? Let's calculate this together. First, let's see what we have. With the data of the weight belt, for example its weight and the knowledge of the gravitational constant on our planet, we first calculate the weight force of the belt. In other words, the force that pulls it down. This is 103.97 Newton. If you can't follow this, I recommend watching the video about pressure I mentioned some slides before, where I go into these in more detail. Next, we calculate the buoyant force. We know the density, for example the density of fresh water, which can be found in tables or on the internet, the volume of the lead belt and the gravitational constant. This results in a buoyant force of 25.92 Newton. To summarize, we can say that the weight force of the belt is about 4 times greater than the buoyant force. Furthermore, we have said that we do not consider the force due to the water pressure, so we simply say it is 0 Newton. I have summarized all the findings again here. To lift the weight belt now, we have to generate a buoyant force with the lifting back that is greater than the weight force of the weight belt. As the weight belt already has a buoyant force and this is also effective, we do not have to generate the whole 103.97 Newton, only the difference of 78.05 Newton. We can see the whole thing again here in the schematic drawing. We saw in the video that both the lifting back and the weight belt were intentionally lying on the floor. After we had filled enough air into the lifting back and thus increased its volume, remember, this was one of the adjusting screws to be able to adjust the buoyancy. The lifting back first rose until it also lifted the weight belt. At this point, the buoyant force was greater than the weight force. We now have all the information we need to calculate the necessary volume, the liters of air that we have to fill into the lifting back. We now call the buoyant force of the lifting back FB2. As we have already established, this must be greater than 78.05 Newton. To do this, we'll look at our buoyancy formula again and now convert it to VB, the volume of the body in our lifting back experiment, and insert all the values. The 78.05 Newton of buoyant force to be applied, the freshwater density of 997 kilogram per cubic meter, and the gravitational constant of 9.81 meters per square second. The calculator then gives us a volume of 0.00798 cubic meter, which corresponds to 7.98 liters. In practice, the value should be slightly larger as we have not taken a few forces into account. Now I'm curious to see which of you was right. And finally, with this knowledge, let's take another look at the function of a BCD. It works in the same way. The underlying formula is also the same. We can no longer change the density of the surrounding medium, the water, once we're in it. I will leave special cases of non-mixing layers of salt and fresh water aside here. The gravitational constant is also fixed. This means that just like in our experiment, we can only change the volume of our BCD. If we increase the volume by adding air, the buoyant force increases and we rise. The opposite is true if we let the air out. The volume of the BCD is reduced by the water pressure, the air escapes, the volume decreases, the buoyant force decreases too, and we sink. And that's it. That's all you need to know about the physical function of a BCD. I hope you had fun today and maybe some of you will understand a little better the processes that are naturally initiated when diving. You are welcome to write me your opinions or suggestions for other topics. I would be happy to hear them, and if I can realize a topic, I will do so in the future. For now, I'll say all time good air and goodbye. Until next time.